Yes, somebody said, one of our King's houses called in and said, I mentioned retaining the possession of our confession. Yes, because if I've properly defined the words, I don't mind going back to use the word confession, as long as you understand what's underneath it all. There's certain things you can't get rid of that because we're enculturated. They get ingrained in our minds and you just can't shake it away. So as long as you just remember what's underneath it. Okay, here we go. I have on my lap Oxford, turn it around, Oxford Latin Dictionary. Ask, are there any dictionaries I don't have? Don't ask that question. You don't want to know. All right, so in order to properly look at this word, we're going to break it down into two parts. So in the Latin, we have a word that consists of con, and this is kind of interesting, fetior. Wow. We're first going to look up, and then we're going to look up the separate parts. So first, con, and don't think, oh, I know what that means. Prefix. The original form, by the way, was with an M, not an N, retained before B, M, P, and occasional vowels, blah, 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 blah. All right. So the blah, blah, blah was not in the dictionary. It just sounded like it while I was reading. But there are 6 headings, and they're rather brief, but there are 6 headings expressing something with this word con. So con is expressing collocation or simultaneity, expressing joint action, expressing connection or partnership, expressing enclosure or containing, expressing intensity of action, expressing completeness. So, if that makes any sense to you. That's the con part. What about the fetior? I guess we got to go to the F section for that, right? Oh, this is, when the brain stops kind of functioning at this hour. So this actually the festival could get really good now. All right. Fetior, feteri, fascis. Interesting that this word is connected to another Greek word. If you want to go on a maze, which has nothing to do with anything we were talking about, but fadis. If you're tracing words, sometimes you'll find that Latin words actually developed out of Greek words, and you'll trace the Greek words somewhere to the Sanskrit. There's all these neat little ways of finding things out. But under fatior, or fator, number 1, to accept as true, concede, acknowledge, admit. That's number 1. Number 2, B, either absolute or elliptically, specifically to admit guilt or confess. And there's separate things. All right. Second heading, to make an open avowal of, profess, declare, to profess one's identity. 3, to assent, to say yes. 4, to acknowledge by one's behavior, actions. So you kind of see what could happen if you connected the two, con and fatior, you get confitior. Simple. To admit a fact, to admit the truth of a statement, a charge, to admit the commission of a crime, to confess, to admit defeat, to reveal or disclose, to reveal oneself, to reveal by one's appearance. So this is the bulk of this compound. And it's very interesting if you have a magnifying glass, you can read the fine print. is quite fine. But you can see the first uses of the word and where it was used. And if you want to go on a paper trail to look that up, a lot of it's in the classic literature. You've got a lot of classic names here and so forth. My private joke was when I was looking up this word, it says confiture, fitiere, that's an ending, and the third one is fessus. And Fessus, and there's a word in French that sounds exactly like that. It doesn't have the us at the end, but fesse means derriere. But anyway, that was my own private humor there. So what we have is quite interesting. We don't necessarily have, and this is a very old, we're talking about something that gives you uses, which if we wanted to get into precision, we could look at the first uses and how it was used and so forth. But what's interesting about this is the first, right off the bat, is to admit to the truth of a statement, which is more along the lines of our Hebrew word that is the yada word, not the praise word, but to know. It's along the acknowledge or to know word. So then the paper trail begins, and here's where, because now I've given you the word, which is important to define. And I'm not even going to go try and read the Amiantinus because it's ridiculously, the copy is ridiculously blurry. So I will save myself my eyes and you. We have this comparative, it's Erasmus side by side with the Vulgate from 1543, where you have, and yes, I did put post-its in here. But I didn't color in it, but I did put post-its in here. So what we have is somewhat interesting. In Erasmus's translation, which, by the way, he undertakes this 1516, I think, is when he did this translation. What's so interesting about this is that Erasmus did use Greek manuscripts, had the ability to go back and made his translation from there. So when you read a side-by-side of the Vulgate and Erasmus, you do see a slight difference. And this is what's so interesting. The Latin for Erasmus, it's the Latin verb for tener, same like in Spanish. Teníamos professionem. Teníamos subjunctive, first person plural. Keeping, let us keep holding on to, or let us keep. But there's no force like in the Greek. We have that word that is that kretomen, that force word kind of. It's just let us hold the profession of us, professionem. The Vulgate has something weird. And it's weird in that, I'll read you a commentary from Erasmus, and then you'll know why it's weird. The Vulgate reads, Theamos spe nostre confessionem. So you already see two dynamics at work. One, that early on, Erasmus did not use confession. And if you want to split hairs about the word meaning, you've got to go back into the dictionary and look up the prefix pro to rightly identify why it would have been used in the first place. And con and pro are not the same. Oh boy. But, so, teníamos spe nostre confessionem. And where you find out what this all means is in this big tome. There's 9 volumes of this puppy. I just, yeah. So back in the day, old school. Today when you want a commentary, it's one book of Hebrews is, in one book, and depending on which series and who you're reading. But back in the day when you wanted to know who said what, you had to have this critical commentary, which told you what everybody said and what they said about it. Wow. Okay, I did make some notes here because it's all in Latin. It's not all Greek, it's all Latin. But in here, these are all famous people in their day making commentaries. This particular tome right here, I have the book of Hebrews in front of me. So the way it works is the book of Hebrews, first chapter, and it'll begin with whoever had anything to say, whatever they said, whoever they were, and what they had to say. So I'm looking at Erasmus, and just for the sake of sanity, I'm saying that this book is probably a product of maybe about late 17 or older, simply based on a number of things. So people say, wow, that's an old book, but it's not as old as it looks. It just looks really bad on the outside. All right, Erasmus. He specifically he's highlighting the Vulgate, Spe Nostra Confessionem. And what he says here is kind of interesting. I'd like to read it to you in Latin. Spe nostra apu Grecos no invenio. It does not appear to be in the Greek. And I've made my own bullet points of what he said, because I really don't want to read Latin to you unless you feel like hearing it. But he says it's not in the Pauline examples, this particular section, Spe Nostra Confessionem. Not even amongst people like Chrysostom. He's kind of combed to see who has used this. And then he says, we see articles are added to explain how. He's specifically referring to the Vulgate, and he says, we see how articles have been added to try and explain the Greek, which is rather difficult. Remember, I said to you, I admit I was stumped with that Greek. It's such a strange syntactical problem, and I love grammar, so give me something that I can chew on. But it appears that even back then, people had difficulty translating this. It's interesting. He also says, I perceive that it would be wisdom to look back and reflect on 3:1 to understand its better use, which is what I did before even reading this, where it appears as Jesus Christ, apostle and high priest of our confession, and the Greek reads humen, which is of our. Refer back to there to better understand, which is exactly what I did. And then he says the consensus of the oldest manuscripts is that this must be an older recension. In other words, saying that the Vulgate, somebody had already manipulated or modified what we're reading. So, they couldn't even, this one pure translation couldn't even stay pure. And Erasmus, by the way, looking at the Greek, is saying these two don't add up either. They don't weigh out. So not only the word meaning itself, but the translation was problematic. So it's kind of interesting. You get a little glimpse. It's very interesting to see. I'll hold it up so you can see the inside. It's kind of interesting that each one of the commentators are listed, and then the verse that they are commentating on. So it's very interesting. And if you have time to read a commentary, this is very portable. It's very portable. All right. That does bring me back to our text in the Greek. See, eventually I come full circle in less than 3 hours. Which is, that's why I can't do it in an hour, I'm telling you. For the lucky loos that want to look and speculate and talk, I told you I pulled out the Chester Beatty plates, but somewhat interesting here. Chester Beatty Papyri is exactly the exact reading and the exact rendering of what I had written on the board. Kratomen tes homolegeas. Now that we've figured out the let us keep, and I'm glad that one of the King's House reminded, let us keep retaining that concept because it's ongoing. But it still plagued me. And as I said, I went into the grammar books, and what I found was, some of you who do grammar, you'll understand this. If this was being used as a direct object, it would have to reveal, let us hold on to, that would be the direct object, would be the accusative, to the confession. The problem that stumped me is that it's in the genitive, and you can't make it our confession because that would require putting a pronoun, a plural pronoun, ours, which Hebrews 3:1 has, but Hebrews 4:14 does not. And if the writer wanted us to say of us or ours, he would have put that there. But he didn't, which forces you to concentrate on why this Genesis is so, the genitival case of this is so important. So, I'm walking you through the events as they occurred, and that's the truth. But I told you I went into some of, and he and Mounce are the biggest known Greek scholars. And there's a section here, genitive after certain verbs as direct objects. Well, I thought, wow, eureka, that solves the problem, right? Certain verbs take a genitive substantive as a direct object. Wow, great. And I begin reading, and it turns out that our particular verse, he says, no, you can't count that in there. It doesn't apply. So, for example, to give an example here, let me just say to you, when he says genitive after certain verbs, so you can get a feel for now the syntactical essence of our verse. There are categories that fit into, their verb categories or verb groups are included. They fit into 9 categories. When he says BDF, he's referring to this. This is BDF, which I'll get to in a minute. Breaks these verbs down into 10 categories, one of which, the genitive after verbs meaning to fill or to be full, we have labeled a verbal genitive of content, verbs of sharing or partaking, and verbs with a partitive genitive idea, verbs meaning to touch or to take hold. I thought, well, that's our verb, right? That's our to touch or to take hold. The essence of kratomen is but no, that's why I said it has a different force behind it, seizing, holding on, retaining. But at first I thought, wow, verbs of meaning, to touch or to take hold. Verbs of striving after, well, that's like our verb too. Verbs meaning to fill or to be full. Verbs of perception, verbs of smell, verbs meaning to remember or to forget, verbs of emotion, verbs meaning to rule, to govern or to surpass, and verbs of accusing. So I thought I'm going to find, let's look at the one talking about what he's labeled sensation, which is to touch or to, and he's using an example where it says, with our verb but conjugated differently, krateses, touching the hand of the little girl, he said to her, Talitha cum. The verb touching, and immediately after there's a genitive following the verb. Now I'm going to read you what's underneath it so you can see. It says, there's a note of tenderness seen in the genitive contrasted with the accusative, Krato plus accusative normally indicates grasping the whole or completely embracing. And he says, see these other chapter and verses, with frequent negative connotations such as seizing or arresting. See these other chapters and verses. By contrast, krateo plus genitive is partitive with the usual implication of a gentle touch. And then the footnote says 160. 160 says, this may be due more to set idiom, for kier, the Greek word that they're using, is frequently the genitive noun. As well, Hebrews 4:14 does not fit this picture. The genitive is used even though the grasping of the confession is presumably to be a total embrace. Did somebody say grammar? Okay. So he quoted these people. You always have to look for the source. Go to the source. Remember, we're looking at the genitive after a verb. And here's what I said, you know what? This is good. Because both of the things he referred to, the verbs meaning to touch or to take hold of, and the verbs meaning to strive, which are encompassed in our one verb, kratomen, are both here. Kind of. Verbs of touching still regularly take the genitive. Hence, we have this genitive that's appended in our strange setup, to take hold of something, to take hold of somebody. Always with the genitive, especially the part grasped, stands naturally in the genitive. To hold or to seize. And it's a whole label of things here. And under this section is kratein. Yeah, that's our verb. Kratomen, kratein. With the genitive, and we have a whole bunch of chapter and verses listed, but guess what? Hebrews 4:14 is not listed here. So it's kind of like, you're kind of out of luck here. Well, I'm going to go to the next one. To strive after, desire, to reach, to obtain. Guess what? Our verb is not in here. Verbs of desiring, striving still govern the genitive, and I could bore you, but it suddenly dawned on me. This is why Erasmus makes the comment, this is a difficult thing. This is why you see Wycliffe going in the direction which is much closer to the essential meaning of the text. And this is why there has been no fixed consensus on how this should read. Because even the grammarians have kind of went like this. Like that. We'll put it as a footnote. Let's not touch it. Now, and I didn't know this, of course, when I started looking. Of course, if I did know, would that change my mindset? No. But the point I want to say, and actually there's a few points. One, we learned this in studying Hebrew, to be very careful, to be a little bit more humble in seeing, when it comes to translation, the difficulties that happen within the language frame itself. Bad enough that we've gone from one language, from Greek, we've gone from Greek to Latin, and so we've made these multiple jumps, and each time we make the jump, it's almost like a diffusion process, because what starts off as something that is clear and precise, it begins to be diffused as it goes into the next language, because this language may not have the express words that represent what this first language did. So humility, or having a little bit of humility in approaching the translations and not being so rigid, but then concluding, and this is the conclusion of this whole study thus far, that the meaning and use of our Latin word, especially in modern terminology, confuses us, and that the essential meaning of how we can understand something in the New Testament is based upon not just a verbal acknowledgement, or as they call it, a oracular with the mouth, confession, but two things aligning to produce something that indeed it encapsulates the concept of faith. If faith is an action, It's not just simply the mouth saying, yes, I'll do this thing. There are concepts that, now I've explained all this, but there are concepts that are crystallized not using any of these words. What would have happened had, for example, I'm going to take an example off the top of my head, the prodigal. It says, then he said to himself, I've sinned. He said to himself. When he came to his sanity, there's the metanoia part, and then he said to himself, and then he turned back and he started back towards his father's house. All of these concepts I've just described are encompassed in that one picture I just described. We don't necessarily need precise terminology to determine an utterance classifies as, but it need not carry or may not carry the modern terms that we have understood them by. So what this will do for us in Hebrews, it will actually crystallize an understanding of what the writer was trying to convey and how the people who were listening as Jewish listeners, Jewish Christians, would have interpreted and received. Now, all of this brings me to say, I can't look at the word confession anymore and think I had this polarized view based on the fact that modern culture says it's this. Roman Catholicism says it's this. And then when I do all the word search, I find there is a common thread, and the common thread throughout is at the intersection, as I keep referring back to this, as behavior and belief meeting and becoming one, and that is it's why Jesus said you'll know them by their fruits, not because someone's going to come and inspect, but because what comes from the inside is manifested outwardly. Now that has given license for people to say, then you must get out there and do works. Well, no, that's a gross error and a gross misrepresentation of what is meant there. So what I wish that we will retain, because we'll encounter this word again in Hebrews, we'll see it over and over again. The warning to those people was to hold on to keep holding on to not let go of. And this is the witness of our faith. The homologia is the witness of our faith. We don't live in times in this country of persecution like the first century Christians did. But read, and there are plenty of these stories on the internet of Christians going to places where Christianity is not well received. And they know that their fate, it's risk of death to go and preach the gospel. And yet their firm belief is they've been called to that place to go and minister to these people. And they don't wave from what they've been called to do. Now, that's the most magnified way to say it. The Catholic Church took that concept and then labeled it as only those saints who have done great and whatever, but it represents any Christian believer, anyone. Not that you should be ashamed or you should be afraid. That falls into a different category. But expect persecution. Don't be afraid. Understand this is the witness with Christ, the homologia, with the same word, with the same mind, which it's not, none of these words appear in Philippians 2, but it's exactly that. Let this mind be in you that was in Christ Jesus. Though, and the description of how he descended, came down from glory and condescended to man, thought it not robbery to be equal with God. If you think about everything that's being summed up, this is the homologia of our faith. So what is said to the Hebrews is, keep holding on to that. Don't let go. It's not our works of profession or confession. It's holding on to that which we have faithed in and not wavering from that, where, as I said, the meeting of behavior and belief meet produces that which we call the action in faith, and that is faithing in Christ. Now, you can walk away from tonight and say, well, I get it now. I hope you'll use, they'll put these up on the website, or maybe I can have one of the staff people maybe be so kind and spare the people bad visuals as to maybe print this on the computer, make it look nice so that people don't have sore eyes reading it. and then we'll put it up for you maybe in the next day or two so you can have some tools to work with. And if you've taken notes of anything I've said, a good thing to do is, sometimes people get caught up in taking notes. If you don't go back into your notes and make some crystallized bullet points, your notes will serve you no purpose. In a week from now, you won't remember everything you wrote down. But taking your notes, reading them, going back over, making connections to scriptures, and making bullet points that connect with the main thought of what is being said, that you can go back and follow your notes afterwards by bullet points that will remind you. As I have had an experience of people taking notes and they're not even listening to what I'm saying. And if you ask them afterwards what I said, they don't even know, and they have to go check their notes. And if you have to do that, it means that this device, the ear, was only doing half of its work, because you've got to concentrate to listen. So if you've taken notes, please take the time to crystallize them so that next time we go back into this word, you're not going, I don't remember what I was doing over here, but there's just a lot of stuff around me. So I hope that that helps you. Now, I'm not done on this work. I'm done for tonight on this subject, but I'm not done on this work because we're going to encounter some other areas that, while we're on the subject and I've spent all this time, we should take a look at what John's issues are in his use, and we should look at James, unfortunately. And then maybe even address some of the other uses and appearances with Paul, just to kind of crystallize the whole matter. So while it's still fresh on our mind. But right now, what I need you to do is I need you to get on the telephone. Commitments, 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 commitments. Get busy.